All right, is there anything cuter than a little mini chameleon having a fruit fly snack? The answer is probably no. But when you're thinking about how do you feed your mini chameleons and you're thinking about how do I get food that small, well, it's time to consult Dr. Michael Nash and see what he does for his extensive collection of mini chameleons. And so I'll turn it over to the good doctor and I'll see you on the other side.
Okay, so next up, we'll talk about feeding and medicating tiny chameleons. Feeding is one of my favorite parts of keeping these tiny chameleons for a number of reasons. So one of which is that these tend to be rather active and aggressive with food consumption. Really enjoyable to watch, really fun. Plus, keeping these tiny chameleons has opened my eyes to a number of very interesting, small alternative feeders. So because we're operating on this sort of different scale, we have access to some pretty interesting prey offerings. I'll just list off a few that I've used in the past that have been successful. Of course, we have fruit flies. Those are going to be a staple for most tiny chameleon species or even babies. Fruit flies come in a few different varieties. They're all pretty similar, but Drosophila hydei is the bigger species we tend to work with. And then melanogaster is the smaller one. We also have variations on these, like Turkish gliders, for instance, that fly. We have wingless Drosophila. We have flies that have wings but don't necessarily fly. There's some slightly different pigmentation available for certain species. So there's some variability here within the Drosophila. I use all of the different fruit fly types available just for different stimulation, different size. There's a little bit more variation within fruit flies than many people expect. So that's one group. Next up is, of course, crickets. Now, crickets have been tried for many, many years. They're very well established as being, generally speaking, good chameleon feeders. I do notice that tiny columas, brachysia, and tiny other species of chameleons, or hatchlings rather, do tend to grow faster on a more cricket-dense diet. That's just my own experience, and I think the experience of a number of other breeders. So crickets are always on the list, including things like pinheads, very small crickets. Another feeder that I've used for very, very tiny species is parasitic wasps. And this might come off kind of scary sounding, but these wasps parasitize houseflies and a couple of other types of flies. But the ones you find are at garden supply stores, and essentially you buy a bunch of fly pupae, and then these very tiny parasitoid wasps emerge from the pupae. These are very, very small, but they are harmless to your animals. They do not sting. They're very tiny. They're very easy to catch. They're rather slow. And I find that many of my tiny chameleons really enjoy eating them. So these aren't typically found at pet supply stores, but if you look at garden supply stores, they tend to be available. Another feeder that was introduced to me by a friend of mine, Carl Cattau, are aphids. So importantly, aphids should not be used from every plant imaginable because certain plants are toxic. And of course, the animals feeding on those toxic plants also tend to be toxic. So for instance, we have oleander aphids. Those are those really bright orange aphids that you see on milkweed and things like that. Although I'm not aware of any direct studies investigating how dangerous or deadly they might be to be consumed, I don't recommend using them. So if you're going to collect aphids or use aphids, even if they're raised yourself, just think about what they have been eating. Since they eat plants directly, one needs to be a little bit more careful because it's possible that whatever plant you're collecting them from confers some kind of damaging effect to the chameleons eating the aphids that were eating the plants. So what I found is that aphids feeding on peas and various vegetables that are commonly grown tend to be very, very useful. They're small, they're high in sugar, chameleons really, really seem to like eating them, and they have the potential to be readily available and bred very easily. So that's another option that's very helpful for these very tiny chameleons. Of course, there's also very small hatchling worms. And by worms, I mean silkworms, hornworms. These can be used. They're a bit tricky to handle. They're so small that sometimes they squish easily, but some tiny chameleons will accept these as well. As we go up in size, there's other varieties of flies that are available, like house flies and maybe even blue bottle flies, so those get pretty big. We also have bean beetles, which are quite fun, very, very easy to raise, offer some nice variety for the chameleons to eat. Grasshoppers are really great, but it's very hard to find them small enough to offer, let's say, a juvenile tiny kaluma. It's possible, but oftentimes the grasshopper sellers sell them when they're a bit too big for most of these tiny species. If you can find brand new, closed, tiny nymphs of grasshoppers, that might be effective though. The last kind of unique prey item for tiny chameleons, it's something most folks don't really view as a feeder, but it's springtails. So for an extremely tiny newborn chameleon of a certain small species, oftentimes even something like a Drosophila melanogaster is a little bit large for them, and they can still eat it, but keeping them in a bioactive environment with springtails present allows them to eat the springtails, and I have often found that they will preferentially target them, which is quite interesting. So in a bioactive setup, or even not a bioactive setup, springtails are a readily available and possible feeder source if you need to go that small. I should mention that not all springtails are created the same, but every springtail commercially available, to my knowledge, will work well for this purpose. Some springtails I've found locally have actually been kind of damaging, and I would not recommend collecting springtails from the wild for that reason. Some of them have actually sort of nibbled away at chameleons and in fact attacked their eyes a couple of times. I've never seen that in commercially available springtails, only some locally collected ones. So buy the ones available, but those certainly provide another option for food. A note about feeding these tiny chameleons, many folks use these really handy and nice sort of feeders that you can hang on the side of the enclosure, and you can put the bugs inside and the chameleon will slowly eat them over the course of the day or maybe even longer. So although those are nice and enjoyable to use, for these tiny species, number one, I'm not aware of any of these feeders small enough to really accommodate them. And number two, I find it to be more enriching for the animal, especially in a bioactive setup where they might be eating springtails anyway, to forage naturally for the food. So I don't use any kind of feeding cup or device. I simply add the feeders to the enclosure and let the animals hunt. There might be a way to do it otherwise, but that's how I've done things myself. Supplementation for many of these small species can be more or less the same as for other commonly kept species like panthers or veileds or jacksons. I'd say that if one wanted to be safe, the supplement schedule can be more similar to a jackson's and more light. More supplementation is not necessarily better. I will say that for many of these small species, maybe for reasons we're not quite sure of yet, I find that gravid females do seem to benefit from extra vitamin A supplementation. For me, that means once weekly vitamin A. Leading up to them mating and becoming gravid, I offer the same schedule as well. That's a bit higher than we often discuss, but at least for that key developmental time point, that's what I've used. Otherwise, one can use the typical supplementation schedules that have been published online by Chameleon Academy. One thing to note about that is that since I'm recommending simply throwing feeders into the enclosure, oftentimes they will lose some of that supplementation, that coating on them. Since they're traversing an enclosure, they might sort of groom themselves and get rid of it. That is okay. As long as some of the bugs are being consumed with some of that supplementation on them, I think it's sufficient. I haven't had any problems due to the bugs losing that supplementation as they crawl through the enclosure. Again, more supplementation is not necessarily better, especially for animals that are very small, that you're working hard to maintain a good hydration balance for. The powder, of course, appears to be somewhat dehydrating, so you should not be caking or coating the feeders too excessively. less is better, generally speaking. So since these tiny chameleons are consuming pretty small prey items, then the question arises, well, how do we medicate these chameleons if needed? And the answer is very carefully, but we do have some options. So, of course, this shouldn't be done without consultation from a vet, because for many of the medications to be offered to these very tiny chameleons, things like Panicure, dewormer, or antibiotics, antiparasitic drugs, various things like that, they need to be either diluted very, very heavily, or they need to be given in very, very small amounts. This is, of course, a challenge. Prying open the mouth of a 3-inch long Kaluma species is very difficult. It's hard to do that without harming them and then offer them some kind of medication orally. It is possible to do, but my preferred approach is by adding whatever antibiotic or treatment they need to the prey item, specifically to the flies, and then adding just a few of these bugs with whatever medication is required into the enclosure after not feeding the animal for a couple of days. That way, you can be sure that they're getting more or less the appropriate dosage from the prey items. I've even done things like injected a little bit of the drug needed into something like a tiny waxworm or a tiny silkworm. So there are options to get them to eat the medications they need. Typically that involves adding it to prey items, but making sure it's prey items delivered at a time where it's very likely they will be consumed. Now, some certain medications like ceftazidime, which is a very common antibiotic used in chameleons and reptiles in general, only come in an injectable format. So of course you need to go through a vet to get access to this medication. But when you do so, it's very important that the vet understands that this is a very, very tiny chameleon. So often a small physical exam is going to be effective, or rather an important part of making sure that the dose is calculated right and the medication is diluted sufficiently. Many people, and this extends to vets too, have never seen a chameleon as small as what we're talking about here. So it's very important that they weigh the chameleon and you know how much it weighs as well as how small it is before deciding on an antibiotic regimen. Many of the drugs available, as I said, come in only a certain concentration and it might be way too much all at once. So you need to work to figure out what the appropriate dosage is. So I digress a bit. Ceftazidime is an injectable antibiotic. It is possible to give an injection to these chameleons. One needs to do it carefully, but it's certainly possible to do so. The legs are usually where one will inject. Again, need to make sure that the amount and the dilution is appropriate, as is the case for administering medication to anything, but it's certainly possible to do so. If you've recently brought in a group of tiny chameleons, oftentimes what the vet will do is simply look at one or two of them on physical exam, and then you can kind of treat them as a herd almost. So oftentimes the vet will offer medication that's appropriate for various numbers of individuals as long as they see a few of them. That's not always the case, but it's possible. So one can view the group that you get as almost one organism, and you can treat them all sort of at the same time as necessary. Again, that's going to be up to a discussion with a well-qualified vet. But there are some challenges overall. Feeding is very fun for these animals, or it's fun for me keeping these animals, and I think it is for anyone else keeping these lovely tiny creatures. Medications can be given. Orally is preferred with the use of a prey item, or injections can be given, but one needs to be very, very careful and delicate when doing so. Also, feeding these tiny chameleons opens our eyes to all these interesting alternative feeders, which can be quite fun to use and rather interesting and sort of enriching for everybody.
All right, well, there you go. Some tips and tricks on how to feed the mini chameleons. Thank you, Dr. Nash, for sharing your experiences with us, and for all of you. I'll see you next time because I can't wait to hear the next episode of the Mini Chameleon Podcast. Have a good week. I'll see you then.